Hello. Today I'd like to introduce you to the book The Next 100 Years by George Friedman. This book attempts to predict the next 100 years, specifically the 21st century. Forecasting the future is difficult even for a short of a time span as a few months or a year, but Friedman takes on the ambitious project of projecting a forecast for the entirety of for the rest of the 21st century, looking at which countries will become superpowers, which countries will remain in power, and what kind of wars and what kind of geopolitical situations might arise. This book was written in 2009, so we have more than 13 years worth of his predictions that we can evaluate. And he makes his predictions in terms in by the decade. So starting from the 2010s, he makes the interesting prediction to say that the U.S. will face growing powers, growing threats to its security as a few countries rise in power to rival the unipolar might of the U.S. Starting with some of the most interesting predictions by George Friedman. First, Russia will become a powerful nation, and in the midst of this, the Ukraine will become a particularly important region. NATO will abandon Poland, and the U.S. and Russia will engage in a mini Cold War. But by the end of the 2010s, so by 2020, Russia will lose this Cold War and will meet the same fate as the Soviet Union. Many of the EU countries will engage in independent separatist movements, and the war on terror will eventually end. As it ends, Turkey will emerge as the rising power in the Middle East. And finally, China will stagnate economically, and unable to invade Taiwan, it will decentralize, moving away from concentrating all its power in Beijing. Finally, in terms of population, the US will face a crisis as the baby boomers become old and retired and face economic stagnation by this factor. As you can see, there are many predictions that he got right. At the same time, there are many that he got very hilariously wrong, such as the fact that China will decentralize. However, starting from here, we can look at some of the predictions that have yet to come to pass, that you have yet to evaluate. You cannot value yet. So in the 2020s, he makes a few interesting predictions, such as the fact that Turkey will rise economically and become top 10 in terms of GDP in the world. The US, its problem with the baby boomers will become even more severe and face an economic crisis in this regard. The Korean Peninsula will unite, and Russia will decentralize and lose parts of it and separate. These are very interesting predictions, but starting 2030, we can see that the age problem, the population problem, the aging population will further become important, pressing factors in predicting the future, according to George Friedman. In the 2030s, the social problems arising from the aging populations will become even more severe. And finally, the nations facing a labor shortage in all fronts will vie and compete for immigrants, and there will become an immigration boom, if you will, in many, many countries will try to entice immigrants as they to come to their borders. Something you can't imagine under, say, Trump. And finally, and the US and Japan relationships will deteriorate, while at the same time, the US will see Turkey as a rising power and a potential threat. And finally, commercialization in space will become a phenomenon at this decade. Following this decade, in the 2040s, the US will face an era of prosperity, much like the 1950s or the 1920s. In East Asia, Korea will become the main US ally. At the same time, India and Poland will ally with the United States and become much closer relationships. At the same time, Japan and Turkey will become much closer politically, and each of the major powers will install space-based military bases at this century in the time of prosperity. Sci-fi elements start to become much more important in George Friedman's predictions at this juncture. And finally, in the 2050s, war will break out, specifically World War III. This will be a war between two alliances, two camps. One is the American camp with the US, Poland, China, and all of the US allies versus Japan, Turkey, and Germany. And this will eventually end in the US's victory. At this point, it seems as though George Friedman prescribes the view that after a decade of prosperity, there is always an era of war and turmoil. How he knows the end of, how he can predict the outcome of war at this juncture is beyond me. But in the end, he trusts that the American economic and military might will pull through. And that for the 2060s and 70s, there will be a few changes. For one, Mexico and Brazil will prosper economically, and the UK will form its own bloc, much like its own NATO, that it will lead. And starting in the 80s, Mexico will become a major power, not just internationally, but domestically within the US. And finally, in the 90s, conflict between the Mexico political sphere as well as the US political sphere will become greater and greater, and the conflict will arise. And finally, he leaves with an open-ended question whether by 2100 Mexico and US will engage in a war. These are some very interesting predictions, and well, at this juncture, regrettably, we can say that his predictions haven't been too accurate. However, they're interesting nonetheless, and not just geopolitics aside, George Friedman incorporates sci-fi elements as well as ideological battles within his analyses, which makes, at the very least, his book a very interesting read. However, at the same time, there are things that he has gone woefully incorrect, and things that he simply wasn't able to predict. The most notable one being the presence of a worldwide global pandemic. And as time passes, the importance and the ripple effects arising from the factors that he was unable to predict, such as the corona pandemic, will become much more important in determining the political and geopolitical landscape. So it can be said that as time passes, the value of his predictions will become much lesser and lesser. However, at the same time, I can say that George Friedman's book, his attempt to predict the next 100 years, was at the very least very ambitious and worth a read in terms of interestingness. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day.